Welcome to Teaching Truth. Solid as a rock. That's the theme for our reflections this week as we dig into the soil of the final chapter of the Nehemiah memoirs, and as we discover that Nehemiah, this visionary leader, this man of God, was as solid as a rock in the action that he took and in his commitment to God. And today in our reflections we come to consider the failures that Nehemiah addressed, the failures that Nehemiah addressed. Put simply, there was a cancer of paganism that was infecting the nation, and it had to be removed. And Nehemiah was the man to remove it. And we see that in three principal areas. We see it in terms of the temple, we see it in terms of the Sabbath, and we see it in terms of marriages. There was compromised integrity in relation to each of these areas. First of all, in relation to the temple, the failures that Nehemiah addresses. Tobiah, you may recall from our previous reflections in the Nehemiah memoirs, had been a ruthless enemy to the building of the wall of Jerusalem. And yet while Nehemiah was away, he wormed his way back into the temple. And worse still, the high priest had allowed it to happen. The room that he occupied had been one of the temple's storerooms, which was a side room, an anteroom for the grain offerings. And that was a very, very sad situation that Nehemiah not only discovered, but the failure that he had to address. All this happened while Nehemiah was away at the palace, which would suggest that those whom Nehemiah had appointed to lead in his absence had failed in their oversight. And here is a biblical and spiritual truth, that it doesn't take long for the enemy to, as it were, worm its way in to leadership that is not as solid as a rock. And so often people will blindly follow leaders in the path of compromise and disobedience where leaders are not as solid as a rock. It was bad enough that an Ammonite was living in the temple and that a Jewish high priest had let him in, but this intruder, Tobiah, was using a room dedicated to God for the storing of offerings used by the Levites. He defiled the temple by his presence and robbed the servants of God at the same time. And Nehemiah, in addressing this failure, what did he do? Well, he lost no time in throwing out both the man and his furniture behind him. You can almost picture the image in your mind. And he rededicated the room to the Lord so that it could be used again for its intended purpose. Like Jesus himself, Nehemiah had to cleanse the temple, and it would appear from reading the narrative of the Nehemiah memoirs that he was alone in doing so. Nehemiah also had to address the failures with regards to the Sabbath. Things were not right in terms of the Sabbath. Nehemiah took 3 steps towards changing the situation. First of all, he rebuked the Jews who were working and selling on the Sabbath and made them stop from doing so. Then he rebuked the nobles for allowing business to take place on the Sabbath day, reminding them of the nation's violation of the Sabbath was one cause for their captivity. And Nehemiah's third step, Nehemiah was a spiritual man, but he was also a very practical man. Nehemiah ordered that the city gates be physically shut on the Sabbath day. You see, the guards had been willing to fling open the gates to the people, the merchants. They'd probably been bribed to do so. And so Nehemiah put some of his own servants on duty. And he also ordered the Levites to set a good example on the Sabbath and minister to the people. And we need even today to honour and remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. Nehemiah did that, and so should we. And finally, Nehemiah also addressed the failures with regards to mixed marriages. Mixed marriages. Nehemiah saw women from Ashdod, Ammon and Moab married to Jewish men, and he heard their children speaking foreign languages. And think about it, if these children didn't know the language of Israel, how could they then grow up to learn the law or participate in the holy services at the temple? If a generation was lost to the faith, as it were, what was the future of the nation? And so Nehemiah, again, practical man, spiritual man, addressed the failure. He wasn't shying away from it. He dealt with the problem by first expressing his horror that such a thing should be done in Israel. Nehemiah 13:25. In a similar situation, Ezra had plucked his own hair and beard, but Nehemiah plucked the hair, listen to this, from some of the offenders. Ezra had dissolved the mixed marriages, but Nehemiah only rebuked the offenders and made the people promise that they would not do it again. Nehemiah was as solid as a rock in these three areas, in terms of addressing the failures around the temple, in terms of addressing the failures around the Sabbath, and in terms of addressing the failures around mixed marriages. Nehemiah was not a leader who swept issues under the carpet. And if we're a leader today, we need to have the backbone, as it were, of Nehemiah, and those Nehemiah-like qualities of not being shrinking violet leaders and not sweeping issues under the carpet, but of being those leaders who are willing and committed to addressing failures. Addressing failures for the glory of God. Nehemiah was a leader and a man who did that without fear or favour. Join me tomorrow in Teaching Truth as we consider from the failures that Nehemiah addressed, the reforms that Nehemiah then implemented.